Folks, this is Tom Opry, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
Hey folks, Tom Opry here with the Shepherds.
Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.
We want to try to get, we talked last May just kind of about what the issues are here in Scotland and stuff. Give me just a little bit of the history of Scotland in so much as what have been the land use issues and as far as historically where they are, where they've been, and kind of what's going on today over land use.
So in brief, I think most people would start in terms of contemporary history is about 1745, so after the Jacobite Rebellion. So to the victors of war, if you like, go the spoils of war. So Scotland's land and the clan areas were carved up and then passed out to people to own. Sometimes it was clan chiefs, they were brought into the fold, as it were, but people that were loyal to the throne, as it were. And then that I think set the basis for the fact that Scotland's land use or land ownership pattern is kind of unique in Europe. So we've got the least number of landowners for the largest number of areas. So if you like, 50% of Scotland is owned by 250 people. So you've got a kind of skewed land ownership pattern of very large blocks of land. And those large blocks of land have been used in various ways. But if you wanted to partition it, you would sort of say, well, towards the east, more of an agricultural component. Towards the west, then there's still a sort of a lifestyle, less favoured areas is what they call it, where the agricultural practice is hugely supported by public money. There's then the commercial forestry, and then layered on top of that is that there's large areas of land that have been given over just extensively just for sport shooting and for a very exclusive group of people to enjoy sport shooting, largely for trophy hunting in terms of whether it's the number of animals bagged per day or whether it's the size of the deer or whatever. And over time, that kind of messaging, if you take the deer story, is there's sort of the argument that the deer are managed in terms of the health of the deer is perpetuated. But then, I spend most of my life in the hills in the winter time, and if you come into sort of February, March, and you look at the winter mortality in Scotland's hills of deer that have died of starvation because they don't have the right food, feed or shelter, it just says that there's something wrong. It's just that's not the way to treat our iconic animals. Okay. And then, in addition to that, you've got that's how you treat the animal. How you treat the habitat is a completely different question.
What you talked about the wildlife, maybe not being treated the way it needs to be treated in order for it to be healthy in the environment. What would be your idea of how does the wildlife need to be treated, and ultimately what should we be seeing out here on these hills?
Yeah. So I guess what the issue is that you can manage land for a multitude of different ways. And if you're the landowner, there is a thing where you sort of say, well, we have to respect people's rights to manage the land in a way that they want. So for the land that we own or we work in partnership with, our ethos is that we would like to manage it so that nature has most freedom, free of interference from man. So we're not managing for a single species, whether it's grouse or deer or whatever. We're saying, look, what's the right balance? And let's have a natural tree line back in Scotland, and let's see high quality, healthy deer living in our woods and on our high mountain tops. It's like let nature be free. And at the heart of what the Trust stands for are three core freedoms. So the top one is the freedom of nature, freedom for nature to do whatever it wants to do. So it's not our prerogative to say whether trees will grow there or not. We just want to create the right environment if the trees want to grow. The other two are freedom of people to enjoy, so that people can come here and enjoy in a sense of freedom. And the other one is freedom for communities to benefit. So we're not against having people living in these areas, of course. The Highlands have always been full of communities. It's just that what's the economic future for the people living in the Highlands? And we think that there's a really good model where you value the natural assets that you have. Some of the natural assets that we have are, the highest in the world.
Now, you'd mentioned that it's this economic engine that needs to be out here. We talked about the internet, the folk that can come from the cities and live out here. The folks that come out here and live in the cities, do they have any clue on how to live with nature?
And you hear a lot about that. You hear a lot about the people in the inner cities know nothing. And who are they to tell us how to manage these areas? And I think there's different aspects to that. So if I speak personally, I think I was speaking to a group of people recently, and I was called out for failure to recognise my own privilege. So I've been born and brought up in the Highlands all my life, and I've consciously chose to live in rural areas and in rural communities because it's a lifestyle that I was born into. When you see people from urban areas coming in, and you've got options, do you just dismiss their voice because they don't share the background that I do or that privileged upbringing? No, you don't. You listen to them and you help educate them. You explain to them what the management issues are, and then you talk them through. So an example recently was, 18 months ago, I walked with a group of Muslim hikers up the Nevis Path, and they were from Glasgow and Manchester, and they were absolutely amazed at the quality of the landscape. So compared to an urban environment, they thought this was the most splendid thing they'd ever seen. For my eye, and we're not looking at it here in this situation, but for my eye, what we were looking at that day was square blocks of commercial forestry in the landscape, a landscape completely overgrazed by sheep and deer, and in many ways no natural tree line. And you just thought, this isn't what Scotland could look like. But compared to what they know in their urban environments, it was fantastic. And there's a debate to be had there about, and our job is to sort of explain to people is what Scotland could be like if nature was left to its own devices.
Let's talk about deer. What is the issue with deer? Historically, what's gone on, and what is your thoughts about deer here in the Highlands?
Yeah, so deer, iconic animal, biggest land mammal in the UK. Fantastic animal. I've been brought up with them all my life. The problem is that they are. We also probably have some of the smallest red deer in Europe, and that's simply a consequence of the poor quality habitat that they live in. It's well known that if you allow our red deer populations to get access to good food and shelter by providing woodland environments in the wintertime, their body size near doubles. So the issue is that because of a trophy shooting element, that where people want to maximise either and it's not actually the size of the head, because that would be illogical. If they wanted really big heads, they would provide better feeding. And then they sort of get around that, and you'll see in lots of areas in Scotland, they winter feed stags because they don't have enough nutrition. So they try and give them minerals to give them bigger heads. They're called feeder stags. And then the guests come up and they get to see these big stags, completely artificial. But they're sort of farmed animals that are being let out. At the start of the season, these farmed animals are at the roadside. 1st of July, and they're still at the roadside. They're just beginning to wander up. And in a sense of, is that really a sport? Is that the way that we want to manage our wild population? So for me, it's about saying that let's reduce our deer population, let's improve the quality of the deer that we have by giving them food and shelter. The difficult bit in there is, who am I to say at what density we reduce the deer down to? And the ideal density for an area like this to get the trees to grow is probably 2 deer per square kilometre. That's what you're going to aim for. To manage deer at 2 deer per square kilometre, you are hitting them really hard all the time. It's really hard graft for the guys on the ground. If you once you get the woodland away a bit, then you can maybe move up into the 5-6 deer per square kilometre. But in large areas of Scotland at the moment, the deer density is 15 to 25 deers per square kilometre. And that's not only changing that you won't get trees, that's taking the heather off the hillside, so you're left with grassland. It just goes all over the place, yeah. So how we're starting with the villain argument. So who's the villain? Are in a sense is the way that the deer debate is portrayed by the conservation movement, that the deer are the villain. And I think that's unfair. I think that the deer aren't the villain. Deer are just there. They're in this country, they don't have any natural predators, and their numbers will naturally increase until they're all dying of starvation, and they'll destroy the habitat that they're on. So then the question is, well, who is it that controls and decides the number, the density of deer, and then for what purpose? So at the moment, large parts of Scotland, that deer density is controlled by people who have an interest in sport shooting, and their interest is to have higher deer numbers. So they manage the land on which the deer live purely for the deer. and therefore that means that there's no trees, there's very little winter food or shelter for the deer, and the quality of the deer is poor. So we have some of the smallest red deer on the world because of the poor habitat and lack of winter shelter. So in a sense, in that argument, then who's the villain? So the villain, and I guess it depends on your perspective. If you're interested in sports shooting of deer, you say, well, I'm not a villain, I'm just like managing the deer because that's my interest. If you're a conservationist, you'd say, well, actually the environment and the biodiversity would benefit if we managed the deer for the benefit of lots of species, not just the deer themselves, and you'd have lower deer density. And I think maybe that's the problem, is that the language in the debate is polarized when we start using words like villain. There's different management objectives, and to a certain extent some of them have legitimately different levels of legitimacy. But the way the world's going, with a growing concern about biodiversity, growing concern about climate change and so on, then managing large areas of land for single species and for trophy hunting for those single species, it doesn't seem to be what society wants anymore. So it's sort of going out of fashion, if you like, and that, I think, is the demise of the Victorian sporting era. I think now what we're seeing is that people are engaged in hunting and shooting for different reasons, sometimes to eat game because that's what they do. We need to manage in this country deer at lower densities because we've got no natural predators and we want our native woodlands to grow. We want to have a natural woodline or montane woodland, which, you know, Scotland's basically totally devoid of a natural tree line. And it's a landscape that you look at and it's beautiful, it's spectacular, but it's very unnatural. And as a conversation I was having with Tony up in the hill there, is that, yeah, I mean, it's like if I went to see the surface of the moon, it would be spectacular. I'd be overawed by it. But I don't want to see Scotland managed like the surface of the moon. I'd like to see it rich in the biodiversity that it can have.
We've been on some estates. We're over on Skye. We're on Ilion Armand, 23,000 acre estate. Their total deer population, they've brought the deer down to less than 300 animals on there. When you say that the problem is these estates that have there's way too many deer, it kind of seems to be like that's a big brush you're using. But truly, is that really the problem? At this point in time, the government's enacted regulations to making it mandatory to reduce the animal populations, the deer populations, so that they're, whatever, densities that they desire for the management of the land. They recognize that. But really, how much of this land is actually really the problem compared to all of Scotland?
Yeah, so and it is, these debates are difficult and you have to generalise. With the deer population in Scotland, all the evidence says it's rocketing. It is going up and up and up, and that your example there of a 23,000 acre estate with 300 deer, that's a very low deer density, and that's incredibly unusual. And in terms of, you look at the populations of deer in Scotland, I think the average in the red deer range is somewhere at the moment sort of in the sort of 15 deer per square kilometre, which is really high. I mean, to get trees to grow and to get natural montane woodland established, you need to be down about two deer, 3 deer, 4 deer per square kilometre, but really low densities. And that's the sort of densities that red deer live at in Northern Europe. So it's, again, if we're managing it, it's like, well, we don't have natural predators, so let's try and restore the damage that we've done to our landscapes, and let's just give it a chance. Once the woodland comes away, the deer population will naturally just go back up again, but there'll be much better quality deer living in a better environment.
The other thing in that estate that we saw was the regeneration of native forest. And what the gamekeeper there, Scott McKenzie, explained to us was that they literally fenced off some areas because they knew that the seedbed existed from the native forests, and that the problem wasn't the deer because they had the deer population under control. The problem were the sheep, with the sheep literally nipping off any new growth and stuff. Really, it's as far as bringing back these native forests, to have that biodiversity in the woodlands versus a monoculture of man-planted non-native species. How do you see sheep in this whole equation, and how can sheep management be involved in it? Because really, the deer are not the issue in many places as far as reducing or allowing for forest to grow, especially, and we saw it firsthand up there. And matter of fact, they're opening up these woodland areas so the deer now have access. Now it's a different environment. They're dealing with weather and things like that, and it's a place where the deer historically have always lived. But what's your take on this, the issue of sheep truly inhibiting the growth or reforestation of these native trees?
And again, it's that in all these discussions, you get down to sort of say, well, you get drawn into talking about deer, but actually you're talking about the grazing pressure. And it's that the grazing pressure comes from whether it's deer, it's cattle, it's sheep, it's different types of deer, it's hares and so on. So there's a multitude of different graziers in there. On lots of the property that we have, it is red deer that's the problem. It's not roe deer, it's not hares, it's red deer. There are areas in our ground too where sheep are the problem. And unless we manage the sheep and work well with the crofters whose sheep they are, then we're not just killing the deer by itself isn't going to solve the problem. We've got to manage the sheep issue as well.
Let's
Should
go.
we? I mean, it gets to the point. We're getting to the point where we're looking at. It feels like, and I'm just being honest with what we're seeing, that the line really is not about what's the best habitat or what's the best use of land. There's available land in the highlands. That's where the deer should be. Never mind the fact that half of the west is farmland. We're not having a discussion about, well, maybe some of that shouldn't be farmed. Maybe we've gone too far with farming. Maybe that should be bird habitat. I mean, so like we have had nobody address this, and yet we drive around and everybody wants to attack the sporting estates for having too many deer, and it's like, well, fucking deer were everywhere. But now so maybe the way to bring this in is, how much of this is deer habitat? What are we talking about? Does that make sense? I mean, a third of this island might be agriculture or something. I don't know what the numbers are, but those deer live down there. They don't live there anymore. Or maybe they do. So,
Yeah, I mean, we've driven across this state or across this country, I don't know, at least 5 times now from east to west and west to east. I've seen a total of 3 deer in August on the side of the road. I've seen 4 deer, all of them on the Isle of Skye, this year. If you drive across Montana, you drive across the Flathead Valley of Montana, where I live, 7-8 miles from one side to the other, you're going to see dozens of animals.
Yeah.
You go across Montana, you're going to see hundreds of animals in an evening of driving. But why I had somebody, Andy says that, well, they all live in the forest and they've been conditioned to be in the forest, or maybe it was Nigel, we need to get them out of the forest because they don't have any predators in the forest and all this. And okay, I get it, I understand the argument there, but these animals, they're woody browsers for a window of time, but they're grazers for the vast majority of the year, so they can be out in these fields, these agricultural fields, or they could be up in the heather moorlands, or they could be in the forested areas. But why we don't see a whole lot of deer yet? You're saying that we have too many deer. Everybody says that, and it's like, well, where are they? Because we've been looking all over for them, but we need infrared cameras or what? Thermal cameras to figure this out. So
it's interesting. It is interesting. I mean, last Saturday I went up north, and in a stretch of 10 miles we'd have counted 300 stags at the roadside. You're just not going to the right areas at the right time, so it's the deer are there, and they're there in big numbers. I could point to a map. Tomorrow morning we could go. I could show you hundreds of stags at the side of the road. Obviously, this time of year they're coming down to the side of the road. So,
is there a map that shows the country here of Scotland and where these animals live? They're high density, because we know where there's moorland. We know that 60% or so of the world's heather moorland is in the UK. Yeah. Somebody's obviously mapped all this stuff, but do you have a map that showcases all this and kind of like, what is the plan to manage all these resources? And does the government have a plan to do this? Are these deer commissions have plans to manage all these things? Do these nonprofits like yours? I mean, why are you guys doing what you're doing, and how does it work in the big picture?
Yeah. So
there's only one question in that whole.
I know. The deer. Let's call it the deer issue in Scotland, has been going on for a long time, and I mean it's such a big issue that there was a body set up by government specifically to deal with red deer. It's called the Red Deer Commission, and then that morphed into something called the Deer Commission for Scotland. So these are government bodies, and that since has been merged into an organisation that's now today called Nature Scot. And that Nature Scot monitor the deer populations of Scotland, so that, you know, in sort of roughly every 6 years, most of the deer range is counted, and you'll get from that where the deer density is at any one time. But the challenges of deer for public safety, for the welfare of the animals, for biodiversity and so on is ongoing, and it has been for some time. There is now, you know, there was a sort of a deer working group did a review and came up with 99 recommendations as to the things that needed to change, so that the people who manage the deer had far greater responsibilities for the welfare of the animals and looking after biodiversity. And that legislation is about to start its passage through Parliament. So the changes needed to come, and it's coming. It just hasn't arrived quite yet.
You talked on the mountain. We talked a little bit about. Let's talk about, you know, the whole reasoning behind leaving deer lay on the ground, you know, after culling them. Okay. Why are we culling animals, and why are we leaving animals on the ground after through the culling process?
Yeah, no, so that's really interesting. So in terms of, in a Scottish context, we've no natural predators. So if we let the deer numbers, and nobody culls any deer, then ultimately the animal that suffers is the deer themselves. So the population goes up, they eat themselves out of house and home, and eventually when, you know, even in mild winters, you just have massive starvation events. And that's not good for anybody. So I think the need to manage wild herbivores in Scotland when you've already removed the apex predators is fairly well sort of tested ground. The issue is, at what level what density do you manage the deer down to? And then what do you do with the deer once you've culled them? So the ideal is that so first of all, if you take stags, you would want to shoot your stags when they're in great condition. So you'd start shooting them from July through to about September. And when they start rutting, you'd stop shooting them. But actually, that's not the current model we have. Actually, the majority of stags in Scotland are shot now when the rut starts. That's the time that people want to do it. That's when it's spectacular. But in terms of venison, that's not the best time to get venison. In fact, there's very few people in Scotland who would eat rutting stags. It's just not, you know, it's tainted meat. So the ideal is that you put it into the game dealer, or you put it into your own freezer. There are lots of situations, the one that we were up there past up the gorge today, where it's difficult to extract deer. You can't get your quad bike in, your Argo cat, whatever. You could get, obviously, helicopters, you could get in. But the carbon cost of using helicopters to get in, or the human effort required to drag or carry stags out, or even the practicalities of using ponies to take them out in these situations, is such that the economic cost is super high, the carbon cost associated with the economic cost is so high, and then you have to weigh that up against the biodiversity benefits from leaving carcasses on the hill. And, you know, in terms of, in any ecosystem anywhere in the world, herbivores die and they go back into the ground, and there's a whole series of ecosystems then feed off the dead carcass. So, you know, for ourselves, where we can extract them, we do. Where we can extract some venison, we do. Where we have to leave them on the hill, we do. It's just a mixture that we tailor to the particular circumstances that we face. But, you know, personally, I see no issue at all with leaving. I mean, at the end of the day, you leave the gralloch on the hill. More and more people are leaving the pluck on the hill. If you butcher on the hill, you're still leaving the 4 quarters or where the bullet damage is or whatever. So it's just all extensions of the same. And I think you've got to look at it in terms of what is the most practical thing to do, taking account biodiversity, taking account of the economics and so on.
Yeah, let's talk about hunting. You know, we talked about it a little bit up there on the mountain, but why don't you give us some idea, David, why do you hunt?
Yeah, so, I mean, like most people brought up in the Highlands, one way or another, you've either got friends or family that give you an opportunity to get to stalk. My father started off his life as a stalker, then we worked with the Deer Commission, so he introduced me to shooting deer. And just the mantra is if you can do it as good as anybody else, then do it. If you know that somebody else can do that job better than you, then just don't pull the trigger, get somebody else to do it. Personally, I enjoy the out on the hill. The thing that I enjoy is the sense of freedom, the sense of focus, or what people would call today mindfulness, just being out there, being with the deer. The pulling the trigger is just a necessary part of a job if you're reducing deer numbers and you're managing deer. The pulling the trigger isn't the bit I enjoy. It's There's something just about being at one with the environment that allows you to get close to deer. And then if you've got to cull them for management reasons, then if you can do that job as well as anybody, then yeah, just do it. So where that then gets to is that the sport shooting model of the Victorian era was that, particularly with deer, game species, it was for the elite, the access to the privileged landowning community, and not for those. And in fact, lots of punishments were brought against people who were poaching deer. Our model in terms of John Muir Trust is to recognise that the need to manage deer for their own benefit and for the benefit of the habitat is a cost, and we're a charity. So if we can offset that cost, then that's great. So what we're trying to do is to increase capacity in Highland communities to make stalking available. Now, primarily, we would like people that live in and around our properties to do that stalking so they can all fill their own freezers. Absolutely crucially, they've got to have the skill sets to do it, and we can provide that training. Or maybe we can't provide the training, we can provide the land on which that training can take place. But once they've got their skills and once they've been signed off by somebody as their competent hunters, then yeah, they're free to go out and shoot their venison. So that's an area that we're moving into. We're in the process of doing big reduction culls just now, so using contract stalkers to do that primarily. But alongside it, we're beginning to look at different systems whereby all members of the community can get involved in deer stalking. And one of those is women stalking, and looking at what are the traditional barriers for women to get access to sport shooting. And some of that is just like some macho society and so on. And it's to recognise, well, actually most women want to put food in the plate like anybody else. So if we can give them the skills to go out and hunt or to butcher, then they don't need to be able to drag big deer off the hill. They can take choice cats on the hill. They can leave the rest for eagles and to go back into the ground in terms of biodiversity. And everybody sort of wins in that environment. Women traditionally aren't as strong as men, so yeah, there are barriers to them in dragging carcasses, but they can still butcher.
Well, they can hunt with men.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about grouse moors. What is the problem with grouse moors as you see it?
So, I think any bit of land that is managed specifically for a single purpose to the extermination of all other purposes is something that we have to look at and sort of say, well, what's the cost benefits? So if it's agriculture where you've got to say it's the wheat basket of the world or whatever, and you've got to grow crops to feed lots of people, then I can see that, yeah, you've got to give over the land for that. And it's the same with urban areas. You've got to give land over for people to live on. In terms of grouse moors, the large areas of land are being given over for the management of a single species for the very privileged few to benefit. And the benefit they want simply is recreational killing, is to see how many of these birds they can kill on a day, and they pay lots of money for it. And I think that's fundamentally what the problem is does that feel right? And then associated with that, you've got other arguments about in terms of the extent to which predators of the grouse chicks are controlled or whatever. There's just a whole basket. It doesn't seem like a good way to manage the land for biodiversity. So that's intensive grouse moor management, where they're doing moor burn and just managing. You see, large area of Scotland's hillsides now, sort of a patchwork of postage stamps of bits of ground that have been burnt to allow the young shoots to come away, which favours the grouse and so on. And yeah, I mean, it was something that was really up there as being sort of a sign of the top end of privilege, if you like, in the sporting world. I think less so. I think you'll see as society moves on, less and less people want to be associated with that sort of activity.
So, but we've seen research, we've seen science, and of course the government has a policy now where they want to have a zero net loss of biodiversity by 2035. They'd like to see a gain by 2040, I think is what it is. If you do away with the management, this intensive management, albeit it is that, the science we've seen and what we've heard from scientists, they've said that there's greater biodiversity on these intensive management. But it makes sense. You're suppressing the predators, you're creating optimal feeding conditions and food and nesting cover. But we're seeing a bunch of red listed birds that are utilizing these areas, but they can't use those they don't have their traditional, it sounds like, nesting habitat for them is available to them. So in non-managed areas, you have a lot less of those birds than you do have managed areas. I think there's even some estates that are you guys have adjacent to managed grouse moors. How do you justify the lack of or the loss of biodiversity if we don't intensively manage these hillsides?
Yeah, so it's a fair point, but I think what it gets to is that there's all sorts of words that we introduce into society that have meaning. So sustainability, biodiversity, and then the fact that we use the word implies that somebody is using it in a certain way. And in terms of biodiversity, you could garden a piece of ground and you could, by tinkering with everything in it, you could maximize the biodiversity. It might not be natural, but you somehow have managed to manage it to increase a level of biodiversity. And then when you hear the argument as you're presenting it, you're picking on certain species. But in terms of biodiversity, the number of species, they're just a small number of iconic species. Those species themselves can exist at lower density within a healthy, functioning ecosystem. And if you look at those birds existed long before we had managed grouse moors. And it's like managed grouse moors are not the reason that biodiversity exists. And I struggle to get my head round even the basis of that argument. Is what they're sort of saying is that we have offshoot benefits from managing for grouse, and we're going to amplify those and then claim that somehow if we didn't manage for grouse, those species wouldn't exist. And you think, that's difficult to understand that argument, actually.
But I guess let's just talk about some of these red listed species. I mean, curlews, the oyster catchers, all these shorebirds. Historically, they've had stable populations, right? Unless whatever events happen, but they have stable populations. So, what if they are red listed? That means there's a problem somewhere in our ecosystem. That's why they're on the red list. So, but they're not. They wouldn't be on the red list if we just sampled the population on these highly intense, managed areas. Obviously, their populations are very healthy and larger. So, what is the real problem? Why are these birds on the red list in the first place?
I don't know, but I mean, at one level, you need to go which species it is.
Yeah. Well, curlews.
Yeah, but so I'm not. So you've got me on that one. I'm not an expert on curlews, but I'm fairly sure that the management and the future existence of curlews on the planet is not down to the existence of grouse moors. That's the quirky bit. Is that, there's no doubt if you manage the predators of ground nesting birds, then ground nesting birds will benefit. But I'm not sure that
case in point, in the United States, we have wild quail, and they're very. I mean, so we one of the things we've talked about with the sporting people, it's like, well, hey, you guys want to have these large bird numbers, large braces of kills and stuff, but the optics suck, guys. I mean, they really do. It's about the experience of being out there. I mean, if you only shoot 5 birds, I mean, we were on a driven hunt on muck, and one of the guns shot 5 birds, but the way the birds presented themselves, the high birds and the hills and whatnot, he said, this is the best shoot I've ever had in my life. That was just 5 birds, not 500. In the southeastern United States, in Georgia and Florida, where they manage, private landowners manage through low-intensity burning, suppression of ground predators. We can't touch the raptors, any of the birds of prey, just like here in Scotland. Yet we're seeing really healthy, robust populations of these wild quail. And then when you go to places where they're not managed, we're seeing historic lows, like to the point where they would be red listed. So is there a problem with really intensively managing for these birds? I mean, obviously you have an issue with it, but why? I mean, if you're going to have more of these animals on that, and people are willing to pay big dollars to go on a carriage-driven or wagon-driven hunt there, and they're only shooting a dozen birds. And some of these guys are paying thousands of dollars a day to go do this. And that's one of the things that we've explained to the shooting guys here. It's like, hey, you can make this into something interesting. If it was more about less animals being shot, maybe less animals, would you have a problem with grouse moors if they weren't managed as intensely as they are, and the purpose of it was not to shoot large bag numbers?
So the bit I struggle still to get to is that there's any biodiversity benefit from grouse moors of any sort. I think that's the bit that you'd have to sort of separate out. I think that ecosystems and the planet looks after itself without humans tinkering around trying to manage for certain species. I totally get that in certain situations agricultural practices increase corvid numbers or so on. I understand all that bit. But I just think that the future of the planet and nature can't be that we need to intensively manage for a small number of species. And biodiversity is very complex. There's lots of food chains, and you're speaking about curlews on one hand, but then there's lots of other elements in that ecosystem that we don't see that aren't so attractive. So you separate out that side and you say, well, do I have any issue with people going out and hunting duck, for example, for putting on their table? And then you sort of say that gets into the sustainable offtake. Without managing the population for maximising duck numbers, you have a sustainable offtake. And yeah, I personally don't have I get that. That's...
Well, interesting enough, you say the thing about ducks. In North America, we have a nonprofit called Ducks Unlimited. You may have heard of them. They've raised millions and millions, hundreds of millions, billions, whatever, dollars. But their emphasis is to preserve the prairie pothole region of Canada in the United States. I'm talking about huge areas. And because of those efforts over the last 4 or 5 decades, we have had over the last 3 or 4 decades historic numbers of waterfowl. But not only are the waterfowl benefiting from that, it's intensively managed for the waterfowl. I mean, it's protecting this ecosystem. Yeah. But it affects all of the animals that live in that ecosystem, whether it be the deer or a possum or a raccoon or songbirds or raptors or other small ground predators, the fish, the vegetation, all these things. And human drinking water is filtered through our swamps and our marshes. It provides for us. Yeah. So I see what you're saying, but is the management here, if it's done properly, even though it may be an emphasis on a handful of species that are used for sporting causes, isn't that having a positive impact on the broader ecosystem, those non-native, or not non-native, but non-game species and things like that? I mean, I would think if you're bringing in, predator suppression, then probably there might be more. Obviously, there's more ground nesting shorebird.
Well, let's take it from there to the carbon debate. So you sort of say, well.
But we're not talking carbon here.
No,
we're talking about.
But I'll take it to there because
Okay.
I think it's relevant to the carbon. Because you're sort of saying, well, in the grouse moor situation, you've got the benefit for the. Let's just simplify it down. You've got economic benefit because you say that income's coming in, and that actually any other type of land use couldn't match that level of income. That's questionable. Come back to that in a second. Then you've got that there's the species that you benefit, which might be a few ground nesting birds, and then you say why, and you say, well, the only reason that you're doing that is because there's a certain number of people enjoy recreational killing of these animals. They're not really a food item, they're just killing them for the numbers. And then you just say, well, okay, but that is the right that comes with that property ownership. So then the next part of the debate is, well, what else could you do with it? And at the moment, there's this debate around about carbon, which is to say, well, we've got a global carbon crisis. So the planet, as an ecosystem, has an amazing ability to capture carbon. The only thing that's stopping it is humans. So if you look at Scotland's land use and you say, well, if we left that land to capture carbon, what would it do? So it would grow trees. Trees would cover all those grouse moors and carbon would be captured. Somebody's making a decision that because of their private interest, they don't want those trees to grow because they want to shoot some birds. That's fine. But then legitimately, society wants the planet to capture carbon. So perhaps then the way to deal with that is just to say, well, there's a tax. You tax people on the basis of the capacity of the land to catch carbon. If you want to stop it capturing carbon, then that's fine. But you pay a tax because society actually needs the land to capture carbon. And that's what it gets down to, is that some of these land uses, when they benefit so few people relative to what society or biodiversity needs are, either biodiversity or carbon, you think, well, it's difficult to sustain that. And that's why legislation's coming in. So Scottish Parliament is just about to consider legislation for is currently actually considering consultation on the grouse moor management stuff.
Now, we've been on a grouse moor after a day of shooting on a grouse shoot, and we've seen, they did, I don't know what they shot. It's 60, 70, 80 birds, something like that. But those birds were all collected from the field, and then were all taken to a larder, and they were all separated by age, old birds and young birds. And then we went down to Tommy Kitchen's restaurant in Edinburgh and watched him prepare wild game, the grouse, on the glorious 12th. So when you say that the animals don't provide any sustenance, or they're just being shot to be shot, but there seems to be a system there that's part of sharing that tradition with the broader public, because you can go in any restaurant. I mean, it's a big deal here in this country and down in England, the glorious 12th, and to have to eat red grouse.
But it's not a tradition, is it? So it's like, and again, it gets back to words: biodiversity, sustainability, tradition, culture, all these things. Is that the grouse shooting and the way that we do it today really only came in with the percussion cap cartridge, which again is part of the Victorian era. So it's, in terms of human history or land use in Scotland, it's a very small period of time where it had its peak and now it's going down. And yes, of course, those who want to promote and support grouse shooting, they make a big play about the 12th. But more and more restaurants aren't marketing grouse. And in terms of the amount of food value that comes out of a grouse, after it's full of all those lead pellets, it's kind of, and people say that they gather up all the birds. It's like, well, if you look at it logically from a sort of a ballistics point of view, lots of those birds are still flying with bits of lead pellets in them. A lead pellet does not kill. They have to get so many lead pellets in a critical area. And you sort of think, yeah, in terms of welfare, that's not just the way to, if you really want to shoot something and kill it to eat it, then do that. I don't have a problem with that, as I've said earlier. But I don't know, it's just not my bag, as it were. I just don't think it's the way that respects the hunting tradition.
Yeah, so it's your personal.
That's a personal opinion, yeah, definitely.
So when we talked back in May, we talked about the fact that you've got these gamekeepers that you aptly reminded me are the people dealing with the grouse moors and the birds and whatnot, and the assistant grouse keepers and the gillies and all this other stuff that your idea of what's going to happen in the future on these grouse moors, that the land ownership is going to change, and that these people are going to be removed from the land. Why is that? Why do you feel that way?
So I don't think they need to be removed. I just think in terms of the intensive grouse moor management driven grouse, I suspect that's had its day. I just don't think society, I don't think, it won't be long before they won't find the guns to go and shoot them, because you can't dine out in the red carpet on it anymore. It's just not, we were speaking about the big five in Africa. People, you don't celebrate the fact you just shot a lion. I mean, it's just, people don't do that anymore. And again, it's sort of the same with grouse. Whereas if you were out sustainably hunting venison for your plate, that's something you could speak to your friends about. So in terms of how that land is used in the future, well, maybe the people who own the land, they can go out and they can do walked up grouse shooting if they want. And maybe they can go out and shoot some venison for the hill. And it becomes a different way of engaging with the land. It doesn't need to be all about numbers and intensity and I don't know, just it seems to have gone. I think history will look back at it with a particular, perspective. It seems slightly out of control, I think.
Okay. And you'd mentioned something about, these folks working for these landowners and these lairds. And, you use some terminology. I mean, you call them serfs. Why would you call these people serfs?
Did I use serfs?
Yeah, I used the word serf.
So, give me the context.
Well, the idea that I think that what you said to me was that these people don't realize it yet, but they're already been removed from the land, because, we were talking about Anders Paulson and the fact that, we're going to see change of land ownership. We're going to see different types of land use in tourism, and that these people, literally, they've already been removed from the land because the land use changes. They just don't know it. And so I'm just trying to get some perspective on that.
So who's the serfs?
So the people that work for the laird, so the gamekeepers and the gillies and whatnot, specifically, yeah, you said that they were serfs.
Okay, so I can't remember saying that. So what I'm going to say,
we recorded it.
I need to play it back to give me the context. But if it's the employees that we're speaking about,
yes, we're talking about the employees, and talking about removing people from the land.
But I don't think I'm talking about removing people from the land. I think that's why I'm struggling. It'd be interesting to hear.
Well, you use the word serf, so I mean, historically, historically, these people live on the land. They work for the laird, and that's
they're employees. But I guess the point is that in terms of the land use in the future, so we take deer, we're going to need more people on the land to manage the deer. So I can't see how I was sort of thinking that they're going to disappear in any way. So in terms of, for us, if you look at our rate of employee, we employ quite a lot of staff to manage the land that we've got. And in the future, I see more people being employed in the land rather than less. So I'm not quite sure where that came from. But anyway, we could go back to then the different economic models that we've got. So I think what we sort of said is that you've got the three. You've got the sort of what we call the back pocket one, where you've got an inward investment model. Somebody makes money in industry somewhere else, and because of their own personal likes and dislikes, they decide to invest it in an area of land. That's the inward investment model. Then you've got one where the economy is supported to a large extent by public money. And then you've got the free market. And the point that you're making back to me is that there's very few areas where any one of those works in isolation. But what we're seeing is that the balance of how they work in Scotland is changing a lot. And that the inward economic investment model from the Victorian sporting estate, I think, is dying out. I think what we're seeing now is a new generation of landowners coming into Scotland, people who are much more interested in terms of a more holistic approach to managing the land. And if you look at the numbers employed by, let's call it the green revolution or the green lairds, they tend to employ per acre more people than the Victorian sporting estates. So in terms of me sort of using a phrase like serfs or whatever, I wouldn't, I'm really surprised you think I used that. But anyway, it would be to, it's just that there needs to be more people living and working on the land, but not in a
feudal.
Yeah. These aren't phrases I would use. I just sort of see it as that basically there's people who own land, and then there's people that work for them and they're employees. There's different ways that money comes into the economic system. Society's changing, that on balance now, people want to put money in where it works for more than just the immediacy of one little sector. I mean, you look at share price in terms of this thing called the ESG rating. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but environment, social governance. It's a huge impact now on all big industry in terms of their share values. So, good environmental, social governance is something that is affecting the big economies of the world. And anybody who's involved in big business wants to make sure that the way that their land is managed meets with good ecological standards. It's just, it's just the way it is. We've come through a period where we didn't understand ecology maybe very well. We didn't understand that the planet was heating up. And as we get to grip with those things, we're saying, we need to adjust. And we need to do it as not in a sort of a them-us way. That's just not going to help anybody. We need to do it and just sort of say, we need to find where there's a respectful way to manage the land that protects those interests.
Oh, that's good. Tony, you want to get involved here? You got any questions? I know you got... Yeah, go ahead if you want to go real quick. But we got cameras and lights all set up here, so thank you.
I'm still interested in hearing about
Stand here, though.
the thoughts, looking at the whole ecosystem. I mean, I mentioned earlier, it feels like everywhere we go, it's like everybody wants to point their finger at the large landowner, and reasonably so in some cases. But if you look at the whole of Scotland, let's use birds for example, the lapwings, these birds that are, I'll call them, for lack of knowing your ecosystems very well, prairie nesting birds. They don't like a lot of cover. They like they're grass nesters or whatever they're, right? That habitat traditionally is flat or flatter, and yet it's covered by farms and it's overgrazed in many cases by sheep. This is my observation, that's all. And yet we don't ever have a discussion about habitat and wildlife related to the future of Scotland and farming. It's like everybody wants to pick on the Highlands. Is that because that's where we live, or is that really the focus of the area? Are we really only talking about the Highlands when it comes to rewilding?
No.
Or are we talking about the whole of the island?
No,
or all of UK for that matter.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you get what I'm trying to...
I do, but you've thrown in a couple sort of different things. So one is rewilding, so we haven't been speaking about rewilding at all, but we can speak about that. And then in terms of the need to up how we manage the land and respect nature is across the board, all through the farming lands as well. So there's a really big thing towards high nature value farming going on at the moment, and it's just that we haven't been speaking about it. Because today we're here in Nevis, we're looking at a landscape that basically is the Red Deer Range. So it's led to those sorts of discussions. If we were in Aberdeenshire talking about high nature value farming, we'd be speaking about hedgerows and all sorts of other things.
Yeah, fair enough. But I'm asking you, like, from nature or from John Muir Trust, do you deal in any of that, or are you only looking at the Highlands? Because no one's talking about the whole. They're only talking about highlands, or when I say it, that I'm not trying to demean anybody. I'm trying to say
that's a good point.
we spend most of our time in these areas where we do see intensive agriculture. But nobody ever talks about that when it comes to habitat. They always point their finger at the moor or the hill or the.
Yeah.
And so, how does it fit in? How does this whole thing?
Okay. So you're now going to get the pitch, the John Muir Trust pitch.
Okay.
So the UK is not uniform by any means. So it varies because of latitude. As you go north, obviously it changes. East to west, there's big changes. Altitudinally, there's big changes. And because of geology, there's big changes. And what that leads to is something called biogeographic zones. So you can study it and you can look at the assemblages of plants and animals, and you can say, right, Scotland has maybe 22 biogeographic zones that are quite distinctive. England probably has another 20 or so, in Wales and so on. So using that sort of work that's been done, we've identified 46 units across the UK that are biogeographically distinct in some way. And the ones that we're in at the moment are the units of the North West Highlands. But if you go down to Devon, or you go across to Peak District or Cumbria or whatever, it will vary. And what we're looking for is to say, well, isn't it a reasonable request that somewhere in the UK, in each one of these biogeographic zones, you've got areas where nature's free, and that we can showcase that? And that's what it's about. So we just try to work with others to showcase areas that represent what nature could do in each one of these 46 zones. And yeah, this is the red deer range, which has skewed us all towards red deer discussion. But
So red deer are not necessarily a species that occupied all of Scotland.
yes, so red deer probably are almost distributed through, but the relative, as a factor for debate in this, red deer are not the issue in all the zones.
And so finally, I want to go back to, because we didn't talk, I got you off track a little bit, with the birds and the fact that we see these, we've talked much about it, and seeing those densities of these prairie nesting or grass nesting birds on the moors, and yet maybe their habitat really has been taken, 95% of it might have been taken over by farming. I don't know the numbers, but are we looking at moors because that's where they live, and not considering that there's other habitat? Let's consider, where is the bird habitat historically, and this goes to rewilding in a sense, right? So if we, and I'm not rewilding, but does rewilding include farmland too? Does it mean like, hey, maybe we should not farm that, or because that's best for lapwing habitat? I'm trying to get the big picture here.
Yeah. So rewilding isn't a phrase that the John Muir Trust would use.
Okay.
Because it comes with all sorts of connotations. Okay. And it's got that reword, which is something about going back. It's just full of so much uncertainty. I just find it polarizes the discussion so quickly. But in the rewilding world, then probably one of the leading estates for the rewilding debate in the UK at the moment is Knepp Estate down in Sussex, which is used to be a former grain producing area, then went over to dairy, and now it's rewilding. And it's much more sort of this sort of European model of you look at the impact of herbivores in the landscape, large hoofed animals and so on, and leading with that. And it's transformational. As an ecologist, it's the most impressive thing I've seen in terms of transforming an agricultural landscape into something that's still a working landscape, producing lots of food, but doing it in a slightly different way.
One of the things you wanted to talk about on the mountain was this whole carbon credit scheme thing. I know you're pretty passionate about that. What is the real deal with the carbon credit deal in so much as how does that really, what does it mean to the land and to the wildlife?
So, and I think the way that we started that discussion is a good one to get into, is that if you look at what the UK's contribution to the carbon emissions of the world are at the moment, it's not even a rounding up error. So it's tiny. So our emissions are tiny. So even if we can reduce our emissions or we can do carbon offset, we're making just a minuscule contribution. So when we talk about climate emergency, we sort of say, well, if there's a global climate emergency, we can't deal with it domestically because actually the problem lies elsewhere. Our role in that space, though, is one of leadership, is that we can show how you can transform a carbon economy and decarbonize it with good leadership so that others can then follow. And in that debate, one of the challenges for us is the whole debate round about wind turbines. And yes, in terms of economy and decarbonising, wind is a great source of energy. So we need wind, we're all for renewable energies, but you've got to be sensitive in terms of where they go. And do we just simply want to cover all Scotland's, wild places and wind turbines? And it's not for everybody. And you sort of say, well, there's some areas where we might want to. We spoke about this idea that to be able to stand in a landscape and not see any signs of humans is a privilege that less and less people get to see. And Scotland has still a number of those areas where you can stand and not see wind turbines, not see houses. So the Trust, in terms of what we call the wild land areas, would advocate for protecting them.
But what about this carbon credit system? I mean, where we're planting obviously non-native trees, Sitka spruce, we're plowing up peatlands to plant them on in the highlands here, in the heather moors. How do you justify that in the big scope of making sure that we ensure biodiversity and healthy environments?
So I think that's desperately difficult. So in the sense that if you in terms of what we stand for is sort of native woodland regeneration. Native woodlands in terms of slow growing trees, they're not your high carbon capture woodlands. So there's another debate, which is that we want to offset carbon. I've got a super tanker of oil on the way to New Zealand. I want to decarbonise it. How do I do it? Well, I plant some trees in some other country and I sell the carbon credits for it, and then I've decarbonised and made money. And it's, these are the sorts of policy choices that we make today that we one day might ruin the future.
Well, you were pretty passionate about it, so I know you said you wanted to say more about it. Is there anything else you want? I mean, do you believe in this, or is this something you think we're going down the wrong path, and it's kind of like 20, 30 years from now we're going to say, well, we really effed up?
No, I think we don't. So I do believe in good leadership, and I do believe that Scotland's at the forefront of renewable energies and showing leadership to the rest of the world. I think you've got to watch, though, in terms of with that leadership, is that you have a responsibility to look after your natural assets. And we don't need to destroy everything that's good about Scotland in order to hit the carbon target. That's not good leadership. And actually, if you take about onshore, offshore wind, maybe it's worth just waiting slightly longer till the technologies come along so that we can have more offshore rather than onshore. And I mean, it's noticeable that England's got a moratorium at the moment on onshore wind in terms of England. So why Scotland having to pick up that burden? And yes, there's economic drivers in there that is good for Scotland's economy. But we need to think long term here. We can't just go short term and say there's short term economic goals that we need to meet, or short term or political goals that we're trying to get to, and damage our very natural assets that we've only got once. Once we've damaged them or destroyed them, we don't get them back.
Kind of closing things out here. One of the things I've come to realize that in order to have habitat and wildlife and rich diversity, there seems to be so many competing opinions, personal biases, long-held traditions. Why do we have this social war going on here between all these different factors? And if you would just say the reason why we have this war going on between all of us is because.
So I don't think it's do we have a war going on? There's social change. There's always social change. There's tension. There's people on different sides of the argument. Passion gets raised and arguments get polarized and so on. And it's just desperately unhelpful when that happens. I think that globally, I think there's big changes happening in the world at the moment in terms of our relationship with land, our relationship with hunting, animal welfare. We've spoken about it, biodiversity, carbon, all that stuff is changing at a rate that's faster than ever before. And caught up in that is words like culture and tradition, and people have grown up with a way of life and doing things and so on. And basically there's a mismatch now between the rate at which culture and our way of life is being asked to change and the needs of society. And I think that's where the tension comes, so that some people, when they protect their livelihoods and their their incomes and their families' jobs and so on. They're saying, well, if the lifestyle I have changes, what job do I get in the future? How am I going to put food on the plate for my family? And they can't see that yet. And yeah, that's where the tensions are.
It scares them, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. No, it's any change is scary for everybody, and anybody thinks that you can bring about change in some way that's not scary or frightening is. That's just not where we are. We've got to speak about these issues and we've got to talk them through. But we've got to talk them through, and I guess my core for all of this is that we need dignity and respect. So dignity for all the people and respect where they've come from. They may not be in the place that you agree with today, it may not be where they want to be in the future, but respect the fact that there's good reasons why they're there.
That's excellent answer. Well, do you want to add anything? Is there anything you think that
no,
we're missing? Something you
I'm going to get something to eat.
Yeah, I need to get some food, and okay, let's shut this down.
I was noticing that.
Well, David, thanks again for being a part of the Shepherds of the Wild podcast produced by the Shepherds of Wildlife Society. And folks, David's interview and a lot of the things that he talks about you'll find in our new film, The Last Keeper. If you want to get updates on the film, go to shepherdsofwildlife.org/keeper, KEEPER, and sign up, and we'll keep you updated on film festivals, television broadcasts, theatrical showings, and all the film festivals that we're involved in. And so, again, thank you very much for listening. Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.